Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's GIS 101 webinar about the National Address Database. My name is Emily Reitz, and I'm the Senior Manager of Applications and Technology at the National States Geographic Information Council. If you're unfamiliar with our organization, NSGIC exists to advance effective national coordination of geospatial information by supporting state-level cooperation. We serve as a national forum for the development of capable and future-oriented geospatial leadership. If you'd like more information on how to get involved with us, please visit our website, nisjic.org. Just some reminders for our call today. All attendees have been muted on entrance, and there will be time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, put those in the chat box. They'll be read aloud and answered at the end of the presentation. Additionally, a recorded version of this webinar will be made available afterwards, so please be on the lookout for an email with that information. And with that, I will turn it over to Frank Winters. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Emily. Boy, I'm really happy to be here. Two of my old friends, not that they're old, but friends I've had for a long time, Bill Johnson and Steve Lewis, are here to talk about the National Address Database. And I'll introduce each before some questions that I have. But first, Bill, hats off to your body of work. The first GIO for New York State, position you paved the way for me for. Past president of NSGIC. You worked at the Universal Service Administrative Company. And then in the private sector with AppGeo, that's a pretty broad sector span that you have there. And I'm really thrilled to be kind of on this side. For those that don't know, Bill and I have been teaming up on presentations and conversations for 3 decades. This seems like a long time for somebody in their 20s, but that's the way it goes. So it's really a pleasure to be on this side and with the opportunity to ask you some questions about something I know you're super passionate about. And really, for all the participants, I love the idea that this is just pull up a chair at the table. It's the 4 of us, right? And for those who are going to watch this online afterward, it's just a conversation that you're invited to. So with that, I'm really, really happy about that. But Bill, I've got just kind of a startup question for you. And that really is, what is the nature of an address? And what makes them so challenging? What's the big deal?
Yeah, that's a great question, Frank. And for everybody else to know, Frank and I work so closely together. I've joked that Frank is like my brother. Actually, I've probably spent more time with Frank than I have with my brother.
Yeah.
So addresses. First of all, the U.S. has messier addresses than a lot of other places in the world. Addresses have evolved under a lot of different local circumstances, and the standards that have been embraced of late around addresses are really attempts to incorporate all the different variations in the way people have expressed addresses in the US, because nobody wants to have to change their address. But if you compare the way addresses look in the US with the way addresses look in Canada or in Europe, there's just more variations, more complications. But when we talk about an address database, what we're really talking about here is the combination of that address string, 34 Maple Street, Holden, Massachusetts, and the zip code, and a coordinate pair attached to it. And this is the magic that converts it into a GIS data file. That's that latitude, longitude coordinate appended onto it. And then we usually have some other information attached to each record as well, so we know where it came from, when it was updated, generally to make it more useful and maintainable. So that's what an address record is. And you asked, Frank, where they came from and what makes them complicated. Well, part of that is they are a local responsibility. There is no state or federal agency that is the authority for addresses. In every jurisdiction in the U.S., they are maintained, established, and approved at the local government level. So any effort to create a nationwide database of these means that you got to get cooperation, voluntary cooperation from everybody. So generally, it's a 2-step process. States roll them up to get a statewide file, and then they contribute that to a national collection. And that's what we're talking about today with the NAD.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. That puts some clarity around that. And to make matters worse, you've got the confusion over postal versus location address And for this conversation, we're talking about the location. In your location, Bill, you wouldn't use your mailing address to order a pizza or make a 911 call, right? That would be, both would be cold by the time they got to the PO box, right?
Right.
So, right.
Yeah.
So that's great. So what about the other collections? We're going to focus on the National Address Database, but why, if there's other collections out there?
Yeah. Well, that's another good question. So, you know, there are federal agencies that gather up addresses as part of their mission. The two that most people identify pretty quickly are the Census Bureau, that has the responsibility right out of the Constitution to count all the residents of the United States, and the U.S. Postal Service, but neither of those are responsible for the creation or approval of this as an official address. So you don't, the Postal Service's use case is mail delivery. If you write some funky address enough times on an envelope, it'll end up in their database because they want to be able to deliver the mail, and they have triggers to add all these variations of addresses in there. Which one's the official one? They don't know. They just know that they're able to deliver the mail. And the Census Bureau, they are actually both the Postal Service and the Census Bureau under federal law are unable to release those databases over privacy protections. So we have these collections that you and I have paid for, but they can't be shared. So that's part of why this NAD exists. It's an effort to create a freely shareable, restriction-free data file of the whole U.S., of all the addresses in the U.S., so it is shareable because nobody has one.
That's great. So you just sparked a thought that, NSGIC has other programs that are outside the scope of today's conversation about advocacy and the legislation that we want to influence to gain that efficiency. But for now, the National Address Database that's really the only game in town for freely shareable addresses nationwide.
That's right.
That's fantastic. So in your opinion, why does it matter so much?
Well, addresses, I think, are perhaps the most useful geospatial data set. If you want to be able to take data that's traditionally not geospatial and deal with it in the geospatial world, an address database that is the key to open that vault of all this data. There are databases, there's estimates that up to 80% of databases contain addresses in them. And so if you want to be able to put it on the map, you want to be able to join those addresses, records by address, and then with this NAD having a coordinate pair, a latitude, longitude attached to the address, you suddenly can put them on the map. That's the magic of this thing. And that opens up the use of these addresses to all kinds of analyses about how close are addresses and where are they clustered and are they along the same route, and how can I optimize my travel between them, and all kinds of other things that you can't do without the goodness of geospatial.
That's great, and all those things have societal impacts. That's so by building addresses and making them available, it seems like we're able to do things like reduce carbon emissions, making transportation more efficient and all sorts of things. But with all the use cases that come to mind, what do you think are the big ones? What are the big rocks in that jar for use cases?
Well, there are so many attached to service delivery at an address, but I think the most important one to consider is 911, and particularly there's something called Next Generation 911 that is being implemented across the U.S. And it is, for the first time, entirely based on GIS data like this address data we're talking about. So every jurisdiction is going to be creating very high quality address records that have a really accurate coordinate, not to somewhere close, but to the building or to the door or to the driveway entrance. There are different ways to represent the location of that address. But the Next Gen 911 use case is literally a life and death use case. You want that fire truck or that ambulance or that police car to get to that address quickly and efficiently with no confusion. And so it's a really, really great use case. And if you build your address data to support that use case, by default, it supports everything else because that's the highest and most difficult use case to build to.
I love that idea that we exercise data with lots of uses so that it's ready to go when the most critical use happens. You know, if you only used your cell phone when you made a 911 call, I wouldn't know where it was and I wouldn't know how to use it, right? But, you know, so that idea that these addresses have a myriad of uses, but the most critical one we built to that standard, I love that. Because that's really most critically the role of government. You know, like the most important thing government does is help people in their worst day, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you know, we talk about the density of addresses and whatnot, but there's a special consideration in rural areas, and I'd like your take on addressing in rural locations around the country.
Yeah, and that's another really good question because the things that trigger fixing and improving address data are transactions that use the data, and those are naturally concentrated in areas where more people live. And so you get much fewer of these in sparsely settled rural areas. And so address data, I don't care which source you're looking for, tends to be weaker in rural areas. It tends to be the coordinates may not be as accurate. Addresses are spread further apart, and so the errors from the kinds of things, geocoding, for example, that you can use to determine where an address might be located, are not as good in rural areas. And so it's a more expensive proposition, a more difficult, more challenging proposition to get addresses right in rural areas. And that's why, you know, all the commercial firms that have address data, you know, their return on investment is much lower in a rural area, so they're not going to invest as much effort there either. So it really is the role of government, and particularly 911, to get every one of these addresses right, including the most difficult ones out in the most rural areas. So that's another reason why doing this work around the next gen 911 use case is so important.
Oh, that's great. That brings a story to mind. And you'll recall in 2015, a couple of guests of the prison system decided to check out before their stay was really over, and they were off in the woods in the most remote places in northern New York. And the first person that was allowed into the command center after several days, who was a civilian, was Jerry on our team, and he came with leaf photography and parcel data, but he came with the addresses, a dot on the map of every dwelling, every hunting camp, every house that there was a record of in the 911 data, and it was on the rooftop. And that was the use case that explained to so many people why we do the things we do the way we do them. It was so
That's
great.
right. That's absolutely true. Yeah, that escape from Dannemora.
Yeah.
Terrific proof of the value of these addresses.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great. Thanks, Bill. I'm gonna switch and throw some questions towards Steve. And first, Steve, also hats off on your body of work. And you know, until recently, being the chief geospatial information officer for the U.S. Department of Transportation, our conversations go 20 years back into the days of both sitting around the table at GIST. And now, welcome to the side of the retired geo geeks soon. So happy to have you here, and really hats off to the mark you left, and you left your fingerprints on our country, because I believe that the National Address Database it exists because you made it happen, right, in 2015. So we owe a debt of gratitude to you for that work. So we've been on the same page with the National Address Database for years, and this is just a great opportunity to have that conversation. So I really want to get kind of in your head a little bit, and what excites you the most about the National Address Database?
Thanks, Frank. And what really excites me most is the true partnership effort that this is. Yes, I have been the primary federal partner, but in actuality, this would not have happened without partners from state government, local government, and even tribal governments. So I can say for sure, I can't speak for other federal governments, but this is the first national level geospatial data set that DOT has compiled that has been 100% built through these partnerships with authoritative partners. And just to dive a little deeper into the partnerships, I want to start with a little history of the National Address Database. As Bill stated, before the creation of the database, there was no nationwide public domain data set because those Census and Postal Service data sets were protected. So I know for years that NSGIC as an organization advocated for the National Address Database, and they quite frankly were in a recruitment mode, looking for a federal agency willing to step up and lead this effort. And after quite a bit of gentle and then not so gentle arm twisting, DOT stepped up to the plate and agreed to be the primary federal partner in this effort. And that's not without good reason. The US DOT houses the National 911 program, and that's addresses are very important to that. And from a geospatial standpoint, we also have a database, a complete database of roads, and you can't really have an address without a road. So DOT was the logical primary federal partner. And what we did to start, and in the spirit of the partnerships, we held what we called the NAD Summit back in the spring of 2015. And we ran it like an advisory committee. We only had invited participants. And when we met, there were 58 of those invited participants. And we went very heavily on authoritative address providers. So of the 58 participants, 35 of them were from state, local, and tribal address programs. Not surprisingly, there was unanimous support for building a national address database by compiling authoritative data and bringing it to a national level data set. So we immediately followed up on that summit with a pilot program. We initially took on 3 partners for the pilot. We had the state of Arkansas, the state of Arizona, and Boone County, Missouri. There was no state address program in Missouri, so Boone County was selected as a local partner. As part of the pilot, we worked with these 3 partners and developed a minimum content schema, primarily based on the NINA standard for addresses. And the reason behind the minimum content was to provide a low bar of participation for our authoritative partners to submit their data. So as we progressed, we took Arizona, Arkansas, and Boone County, Missouri, and compiled it into a national database and started spreading it around. Almost immediately after showing this off to NSGIC and other organizations, we got 4 additional states, the District of Columbia, and 9 additional Missouri counties. So by the time the pilot ended in July of 2016, we had release 1 of the National Address Database, and it was 16.8 million records. Admittedly, there was a little bit of a downtime after that, as we spent almost a year looking for resources to continue this development. And the National 911 program stepped up to the plate after a year. They came up with consistent funding, and in July 17, we began full-time development of the National Address Database. There was some fits and starts along the way, but we've been pretty much rock solid since March of 2020. And we publish the data quarterly. And our most current version is release 15. That version, recall the first version was only 16.8 million records. We now have data from 35 state partners, 42 local government partners, and 2 tribal government partners, and we are up to 76.8 million records. All of this done with no carrot, no stick, just partnerships.
Oh, that's a great story. I mean, that's a story that's like what's right with government, right? That's great. So about these partnerships, can you shed a little light on the roles and what governance means to you, and maybe the challenges there?
Sure. Start with the governance, we went into this, and it was affirmed through that NAD summit way back in 2015. We went into this with no intention of owning this data. So we don't edit the data, we don't move the data. It's we are providing a partnership role, and that leads into the partnership roles. The most important partners are the state, local, and tribal government address programs that provide us our data. And because they are the most important partners, we at the DOT don't own that data. So what does DOT do? Well, as the primary federal partner, we take each data submission, and if the address provider has not already done the transformation into our minimum content schema, we transform the data into the minimum content schema. We then do some very high level QA/QC, and that includes checking for duplicate points. And also, if an attribute has a published domain, such as street type, we check the values in the submission against the published domain. And then for each of those submissions, we provide a customized feedback report for the partner and provide that back. If we found if we found errors in that partner data, or we think there are errors, we don't correct them. We send it back to the partner. If they agree it's an error and correct it, it'll go into the database. If it's not resolved before time for publication, those particular records just don't make it into the most current publication. But after we've provided the partner with the feedback, worked with them to reconcile any differences, we compile the national data set, and we distribute it to anyone who wants it via bulk download and a web feature service. So we also have a couple of other federal government partners. The Census Bureau takes each release, and before we make it public, they do some final quality checks just to get a second set of eyes on it. And our newest partner is the U.S. Postal Service. A lot of our authoritative data providers have mentioned they would like to get zip codes from the Postal Service. So now the Postal Service ingests each release of the NAD. For records that they can match, they append their zip code to those records, and then we will provide that data in the public release. It's always going to be a one release behind, because we're appending data from a previous release to the current release. But the next release of the NAD will be the first one that contains the zip code information. And of the 76.8 million points I mentioned, they matched over 66 million points to their data. So we'll have zip code information there.
Steve, are those zip +4, or is it just a 5-digit zip?
You know, I haven't looked. My developer did the matching, and I haven't looked. I hope it's +4, but it might only be the 5 digits. Mm. Some of our partners don't even submit zip code, and some are looking for a validation of it. So this will go into the feedback reports that we give to the partners, how many of their zip code records matched, and you know, things like that for their feedback reports.
Yeah, and if I could interrupt, Frank, I know you got questions here, but a pet peeve of mine is zip codes. You know, people think zip codes are polygons. Zip codes are not polygons. Zip codes are address lists, groupings of addresses from the Postal Service. So any polygon file you see of zip codes, somebody made it up. There is no such thing as an official zip code polygon, which makes it tough to know exactly if you're out in a rural area and you're not sure where those lists switched. You can easily attach the wrong zip code to a file and not know it.
Yeah, that's great. And what an advance. And the thing that comes to my mind is for those folks trying to manage addresses at a local or state level, you can't win if you don't play, right? I mean, there's a value that comes back, and that's really a great snapshot of what a partnership really is. We're not talking about a federal data set. We're talking about a national data set with value add along the whole supply chain, right? And I think about the flow of data like we think about a commercial supply chain. So that's something I just learned. So thanks very much for that. Steve, can you shed a little light on the status, maybe the where we stand with state partners and their programs and how they contribute?
Sure, Frank, let me bring up some graphics because it's easier to go through it that way.
I think you have anticipated my question. That's good.
Okay, so I hope everybody can see my screen. I'm in Adobe Acrobat, so I apologize for the frame around it. But this is our latest partnership map, and this is by state because our preferred partnership level is at the state because that's obviously much fewer submission than if we had every county or city submitting to us. So you can see here on this map, and this is for release 15. We have the states in green are our official partners who have submitted data. In some cases, they aren't able to submit complete data, but they have submitted at least some data towards the national address database. The states in yellow and the two territories you see there down in the lower right corner, they are committed partners to the national address database, but they have still yet to submit data, although I expect to get data from Idaho for release 16. And actually, we do have a brand new submission from West Virginia we're processing, and hopefully it'll go into release 16. So the next level are the light purple states, and those are just states that don't currently have a address program at the state level, so there's no roll up. And then my least favorite color on this map are the dark purple states. They have complete rolled up address information, but they have policies or laws prohibiting them from sharing the data. So we're working to change that as well. And in fact, I just heard from Minnesota this week. They are in the final stages of getting that policy changed, and hopefully we'll have Minnesota represented soon. But a part of this map that really illustrates the partnership and the true desire to have this be a success are the light purple and the dark purple states that have hash marks. In these states, local, regional, or tribal governments have decided they want their data in the national address database, even if it's not coming from the state level. So you can see there we have local, regional, tribal governments in the dark purple states and the light purple states that are submitting data directly to the NAD, and they are treated as full partners. They get the same feedback reports as the state levels. And again, to me, it really illustrates the true partnerships here.
Well, that's great. And can I suggest a new title for that map?
Sure.
The Race to Not Be Last.
There you go. And also call it the map of shame.
Right. And the thing that comes to mind is there's value to the people of the country by participating. When Google picked up the New York State addresses, once we got the licensing all figured out for the NAD, so thanks for the work on that, they found a huge number of addresses in New York that they didn't know about. And the number of calls that the GIS program office got from our people saying, hey, can you do something about these addresses because my guests aren't able to find me, or I can't get my packages, or and I'm not picking on Google. It's all of the companies that need the addresses to really play in the information economy. They're pulling up the NAD. That's the way to get the data to those companies. And our people don't experience our work by coming to our state websites and downloading 9 million address points. They experience our work on their phones or in their commerce, right? So that tipping point, I think, is really that map gave me a lot of courage. So thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. So this current map on the screen, I had mentioned not every state partner could do complete submissions at this time. So the green on this one gives you the idea, or gives you a good idea of where the data actually exists and where it's coming from. So the green on this map represents the 76.8 million points. And let's see. Just wanted to highlight some of the growth and how it's been consistent. You can see here, I went back to March 2020. I mentioned that's when we really got funding, and there were no more. Can you still hear me? I got a message. Zoom stopped.
I
Yeah,
can
I
hear
can
you,
hear you.
Steve.
Oh,
Yep.
and the message keeps coming up, but
Now you're muted.
sorry about
There you
that. I
go.
did get kicked out. So let me show one more slide with hopes of not getting kicked out again. But
It's a fast recovery.
yes. So this one I'm very, very pleased with, because what good is having a public database of addresses if it's not being used? So I'd mentioned earlier that one of our partnership roles at DOT is to produce and maintain a web feature service that accompanies each release of the data set. We host that on the DOT instance of ArcGIS Online, so I'm able to go in and look at usage statistics every month. I didn't get a chance to do November before we started this, so this is for the month of October. And you can see for the month, we had 1,093,000 requests for that web feature service, and that equates to over 36,000 requests per day. And for a data set that probably still isn't marketed to the extent that it should be, I think that's just incredible usage. And it's something that all of the partners involved in this should be proud of.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. Thanks so much for sharing that. And I mentioned in the introduction, as we were just getting started, that congratulated you on your body of work and that you're about to retire. And to me, the strength of a mature organization and a mature program is those that outlive the contributions of the individuals that are really the driving force. So maybe you could allay some fears and talk about, what's the future and what's the succession plan here?
Certainly. That is a very good intro for me to say that the National Address Database is by far the most rewarding project I've worked on. And I have been doing this for 36 years now. So it's very near and dear to my heart, and I wanted to make sure that it would continue to get the support of DOT that it deserves. So I actually stepped aside as geospatial information officer back in October, so that my replacement could come in and I could help guide her in the first few months. And part of that is ensuring that the NAD continues its support. It's been decided that the new deputy GIO, as my deputy was promoted to take my job, the new deputy GIO will be the federal caretaker for the NAD. So in the meantime, I've let everybody know that I will be available to help mentor that person when he or she is hired. And I also requested that Brian Tegmeyer, who is the head of the National 911 program at DOT, and he is the one that provides the funding for the NAD developer. I've asked him to step in and take over my responsibilities on the FGDC address subcommittee, and he has agreed to do so. So I think I am leaving a good framework and a good support network. If there is any downtime, there is a good NAD webpage and a NAD email address, nad@dot.gov, and it'll always be answered. So I will not let this program retire with me.
It is good news, and thanks so much for all of that. And I love the idea that we're playing the long game, right? We're just gonna keep at it. That's so good. Thank you. Well, I haven't paid any attention to the chat because I've been engaged. This has been such a fun conversation so far, but let's hear from our participants, those that have pulled up a chair and are at the table with us here. Emily, do you have any questions for any of the Bill or Steve?
I do not. The chat's been very quiet, so I definitely encourage everybody tuning in to any questions you may have. Absolutely. Get them in the chat.
All right, let's fire it up. So Steve, I really am pleased to hear while we're waiting for that you've done a really nice job with succession planning. And how long have you been thinking about that? And the thing that comes to mind is, the first role of a leader is to make more leaders. So how long has that been on your mind?
I've known my retirement target for many years now, so I've made sure that DOT leadership was aware of that timeline, and they have been supportive throughout. I was very much in favor of my deputies taking my job because she's a great choice and has all the institutional knowledge. So I've been hopefully training her for the last 5 years, and I actually requested to step down from GIO position as early as last May, and they weren't willing to let me step down that early. So it's been on my mind, and I hope I have prepared everyone at DOT correctly.
That's great. That's so necessary, and not that common that people put that much thought and effort into the succession and bringing people along and having people on the journey with you. So again, hats off to you for all that rigor. What do you have, Emily?
Yeah, we asked and the audience delivered. We've got lots of questions in here now. So first one is from Adam DeMars from South Carolina. I'd like to know, how long is the turnaround time with respect to the reporting?
We publish the data every calendar quarter. So Adam, for South Carolina, it would be a first-time submission. So we'd probably want to get it early in the 3-month window so that we could process your data and make sure we don't find any showstoppers in there. But for long-established NAD customers or partners, they submit data towards the end of the 3-month period, and we usually process them and get them in. Frank and Bill's New York State, they are such longtime partners, and they do the transformation into the NAD schema themselves. They just drop it there for us once a quarter, and it's an easy process. So I hope that answers your question. If you're ready to submit from South Carolina, we'd like to get it early in the process, but as we become more familiar with each other, we can probably take it later in the process.
Yeah, let me just add a little bit about how this works at the state level too. In New York, the address work is done in cooperation with the county 911 function, and the GIS program office, the state GIS office, sets up and manages an enterprise database of the addresses. Many of the counties have direct access to read and write and do their own edits on the database. But there's a lot of the more rural counties where they just don't have the people, the resources to do this, that the program office performs the edits on their behalf. They are still responsible for the address data. They're still the owners of it, but they don't have GIS people to do the work. So the GIS program office takes on that responsibility. The database is actually republished every night. So for NextGen 911, those county 911 offices can download daily if they want to the most current version of the data. And then the program office publishes for open release on the state website every quarter. And as part of that quarterly release, they also do the transformation to the NAD and give it to you, Steve.
What a great question, Adam. And that just brings up one factoid I'll throw in. And it's the volume of those edits. In New York alone, there's 7,000 to 10,000 edits every week. So that's where the last just-in-time submission, so you get the freshest stuff, comes in. And like you say, it took a while to get us there. And Steve, one other quick addition to Adam's question may be, what's the turnaround time on the feedback so they can see the error reporting and the changes with your value add?
It's very quick for established customers because the process is so customers, not customers, partners. Very quick for established partners. The only outlier there is Texas. They are by far our largest partner. They submit just once a year because of the volume, and it takes quite a while to run the QA QC and do the transformation on 9.8 million records. So for most of the established partners, the turnaround is going to be less than a week for the report.
That's great. All right, what else do we have, Emily?
Lots more. So Mike Dalbo asks, for the states with policies restricting sharing, how optimistic are you about overturning those? Are there some arguments that are more successful than others?
Right now, I'm very optimistic because, as I said, Minnesota is about to overturn it, and Adam in the chat says that South Carolina is about to change it. So we are dwindling down to a few, not to name names and point figures, but the one I'm least optimistic with right now is New Hampshire, because their state 911 director adamantly believes that he has a public trust responsibility not to share the data. But I think in the long run, we're going to be turning those purple states into green.
It's great. It's and the argument that sticks in my mind is that our economy is information based, and if your data is behind a password, you're leaving your constituents out of a segment of the economy. But with that, it's full respect for those people that own that data, and they have their purposes, and they're trying to be good stewards as well. So it's good. I'm glad you're optimistic. So am I. What else do you have, Emily?
Yeah, Megan Wheatley'd like to know, in terms of collaboration, what does that look like for sharing data? Have other states asked for permission from counties and other local governments to share? Have they just shared their addresses? What does that look like?
I'll start with this one. So the way the program works in New York, and I think it's probably similar to the way a lot of the other state programs work, is that there are formal agreements in place between the state and the counties generally, or whatever locals are contributing, that make clear how the sharing is working, who's responsible for what, indemnifying the parties from responsibility for errors. All those sorts of things go into an agreement. I know a lot of GIS people try to avoid dealing with attorneys, but the attorneys are there to protect you and support you. And in my experience, having a good relationship with the attorneys in your agency goes a very long way to getting these things done correctly and avoiding problems in the long term. So yeah, you do want those agreements in place, and that's kind of the lubricant for the sharing to happen. It's actually a part of the trust that works between the partners. You're codifying it in writing and getting signatures.
And putting 1,000 miles or thousands of miles on rental cars. And I think of Cheryl Benjamin's road trips all around the state, buying donuts, buying coffee, sitting down, talking to people. It's real work, but it's work you do once, and you keep that trust.
That's right.
As long as you're around. It's great. All right. What else do you have?
Yeah. Let's see here. Charlene would like to know, will there be a similar program for centerline data sets?
There actually is in a way already, except it's not really tied to addresses because it's two different programs. At the Federal Highway Administration, which is a part of USDOT, they collect complete road centerline data sets from each state DOT. But unfortunately, that program doesn't have an interest in addresses at this time. And what they tell me is that most of the state DOTs don't have an interest in addressing. So here at DOT, we are getting complete road networks from authoritative sources and complete address information from authoritative sources, but they're not tied together at this point in time.
Thank you. Any more, Emily?
Yes, they're coming in faster than I can read them.
That's great.
Yeah, Elizabeth would like to know, how does the NAD compare to the USPS address checking database?
That is not a database I'm familiar with. If Bill doesn't have an answer, I will say that I mentioned earlier the USPS was able to match 76 million of the 76.8 million, I mean 66 million of the 76.8 million NAD records.
I will just say generally that what the Postal Service is trying to do is ensure that mail can get delivered. So what they have for addresses is lots of variations on how they've seen that address represented on pieces of mail over time. So for your particular address, they probably have multiple records for that same address that represent different spellings, different abbreviations, and all these kinds of combinations of things that you see on pieces of mail. What the Postal Service does not have are latitude, longitude coordinates attached to it. So it's not, if you're, depending on what your comparison is between NAD and the Postal Service, it's really an apples and oranges thing in my mind.
Also, Bill, the National Address Database goes beyond the Postal Service in that we allow address points for places that mail isn't delivered. Some of our partners submit landmarks, even longitude and latitude location for bridges. These are in the National Address Database and attributed as landmarks, and not something that would have a Postal Service style address.
Yeah.
Well,
go ahead, Frank.
Oh yeah, just one of the value adds that makes the government activity in this, local government in particular, so valuable is the crystal ball, right? That the address is assigned well before anything happens on the ground. So if there's a 911 call when folks are digging a foundation for a house, well before any mail ever gets delivered there, that should be in there, right? So it's the early notification that is a big part of the value add. So go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say that one of the reasons for landmarks being in an address database is for 911. Incidents happen at those kinds of locations, and those are, so to be able to get somebody to that point immediately that's the goal.
That's great. All right, Emily, what else do we have? We have a few more minutes.
Yeah. So Jenny is curious about confidence and reliability of the database. You'd mentioned that there are some high-level QA, QC steps, and that this information is useful for 911. So is there a recommendation of what kinds of implementations are wise, and what's the likelihood of encountering errors in geocoding?
Well, I'd like to say that at the lowest level, this data is being collected by local governments. In almost every case, it's being collected for emergency response. So in my opinion, and it's the way I've always felt since we started this, it's good location data from the start. So that's why our QA/QC is more along the lines of looking for duplicates and checking enumerated domains. So I truly believe it's the finest level of accuracy in any geospatial data set that's available.
Yeah, and to add to that, Steve, you might recall the NSGIC webinar that we did with one of the early NSGIC presidents, who was an attorney and a GISP, Bill Holland. And through that, we talked about licensing and liability, and we sort of settled in on Creative Commons 0 as the way to allow our data to be out there, but not guarantee it for any particular use, and give ourselves some kind of consistent protection. The more consistent our licensing is, the easier it is to understand and adhere to. We don't have 1,000 different agreements. We have one. Okay. Emily, what do you have?
Yep. Next person would like to know, how can we get the post office to respect the authoritative addressing from the local governments rather than addresses from mail senders that may or may not be accurate? Question of the century, isn't it?
I don't think there's much that the NAD, people behind the NAD can do to influence how the post office respects their data sources. They have a specific use case. and their systems are all engineered for efficiency around that use case. And so it is what it is.
Yeah, I'm just grateful that they are contributing those zip codes back, and that's that's a huge step forward. But I agree, it's a tough one. Good question.
Yeah, to go a little bit more general here, could you please describe the NAD partnership process?
It's very loose. There is no official memo of agreement or memo of understanding. It's just prospective partners contact me or my replacement or that generic email address, nad@dot.gov, and just tell us you want to be a partner. We'll set up a quick Teams or Zoom call to go over the process and also ensure that you're 100% comfortable that this data is going in the public domain. From there, we work out how to receive your data, we transform it, we send you the report, and it gets included in the next release. So this goes to prospective state partners, county, tribal, regional government partners. That process is the same. And part of the reason it's the partner contacting us instead of the other way around is that as a federal employee, I'm very much subject to rules against doing that kind of outreach. So partners come to me, it makes it very much better all the way around.
Well, and I think this is this session we have going on right here, right now, is a really good example or federal agency with an initiative, but it's NSGIC that's also playing a role in convening the forum of the states, so that's really a good model. That's one of the reasons we're here. It's great. All right, Emily.
Yeah. Next question is there any schedule for states to resubmit or update their data?
There's no published schedule. We are in the process now of closing out release 16. It should be published by the end of this month or very early in January. So we really can't take any new submissions for release 16, but beginning January 1st, we are ready to begin taking submissions for release 17, which will be published by the end of March.
Another question of the day here. What is it going to take to have the data that the broadband program needs?
Oh, somebody must have known I was on this webinar.
Yeah, I'll let you take that one, Bill.
Yeah, so for those of you maybe less familiar with the issue, the activity that's happening right now with massive new federal funding to extend broadband to everybody in the U.S. This $42 billion that was in the Infrastructure Act that is being routed out through the states to build broadband to unserved and underserved locations. And the basis for doing that is a map that the FCC has published. And it's at the location level of granularity for the first time, which is great. But what the FCC chose to do is license a commercial data set of those locations. They call them broadband serviceable locations. It's essentially an address point data set. And so we have a major federal program going on right now that's based on a commercial data set that cannot be freely shared. I think that's a public policy mistake. And one of the goals I have is to see that we can do a replacement of that commercial data set with public data. And I think it's achievable. I think it's an achievable goal. It's not ready to happen instantly, but I think the motivation for it to happen is there, and the willingness of states is improving every day. I think it's a dream that we could realize. Anyway, thank you for asking that, by the way.
Yeah, that's another reason to be optimistic too, and that lines up with the motivation for states to get involved and the states turning green on Steve's map too. We're in better shape than we were when that decision was made, so that's great.
So, I guess to kind of step back a little bit again, can you expand on what open source means in this context? And is it possible to access open source data from anywhere?
That's a tough one. Open source is a different thing than the NAD. The NAD attempts to um, establish partnerships at the source, at the authoritative source of the addresses. Whereas the open source projects, Open Address Project and OpenStreetMap and those things allow anyone to contribute. And so you get a mix of different quality of data that all coexist together in a collection, an open source collection. So that's something different than what the NAD is trying to do here. I don't know, Steve, do you want to elaborate at all on that, or Frank?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely hitting the head on the nail on the head. With one addition, the National Address Database is welcome to be used for any lawful purpose. So it can play in that environment. It's just not a crowdsourced data set. Although, maybe the crowd is small and authoritative, in the way it comes together.
Yeah, I characterize it as open data that is compiled from authoritative sources. So
Yeah.
there's no volunteer geographic information in there. It's all authoritative data, but it is fully open.
Good question.
All right, looks like we've got just one more here so far. And I believe it might have already been addressed, but just in case, what were / are the submittal dates to get into version 16 of the NAD?
Yeah, I think that boat's already sailed. Release 16 is going to be published in just a couple of weeks, so we won't be able to include any updates or new data for release 16 at this point. But beginning January 1st, we're ready to take updates from existing partners and new submissions from new partners.
Cool. All right, I think have reached the end of the questions as I've been scrolling through. I see lots of great conversation and answering each other's questions in the chat. Love to see it. If people do have more questions, where can they send them?
Or Bill Johnson.
Well, you can, but I think that, the NAD address would probably be the logical place.
Yes, NAD@dot.gov, and I will drop that in the chat for everybody.
And just one comment, the audience here is fantastic. We sort of have the choir. The recording of this might be a useful tool once it's published, so that the people who don't have the same lens on this, that are making some of the policies or deciding whether they're going to participate or not, this is intended to be a tool for those folks, just to gain some different perspective.
Yeah, the recording of this will definitely be available on the NSGIC knowledge base, and it will also be in YouTube as well. So you can look for that there. I'll send an email out to all the registrants with those links once the recording's been processed and uploaded and all that good stuff. So thank you so much, everyone. This has been amazing.
No, thank you. Thanks, Bill and Steve. This has been certainly a highlight of my week, and we'll charge ahead.
Yeah, great to be among friends.
Thanks,
Absolutely.
everybody.
All right, see ya.
Yep.